Before the world knew the name of Simo Häyhä, he was simply a farmer's son in the quiet countryside of southern Finland. The land there is flat and open in places, broken by dark forests and frozen lakes that stretch like sheets of glass beneath a pale winter sky. In summer, the fields breathe with grain and the air smells of soil and pine. In winter, everything hardens. The wind cuts through wool and leather. Sound carries for miles across snow. It is a landscape that teaches patience, silence, and precision. Häyhä was born in 1905 in the rural municipality of Rautjärvi, near the Russian border. Like many Finnish boys of his generation, he grew up working the land, tending animals, cutting timber, and learning to survive in an unforgiving climate. There was nothing glamorous about it. Farm life demanded discipline. You woke before dawn. You worked until your hands cracked from cold. You fixed what broke. You endured. But there was another education taking place beyond the fields. Finland had a strong hunting culture, especially in the countryside. Small game and larger animals alike were part of rural life, both for food and for skill. Shooting was not sport alone, it was practicality. Ammunition was valuable. A missed shot meant wasted money, wasted effort, perhaps even a lost meal. Accuracy mattered. As a young man, Häyhä joined the Suojeluskunta, the Finnish civil guard, a voluntary militia that trained civilians in basic military skills. There, he refined what the forest had already begun to teach him. He practiced marksmanship regularly and competed in local shooting events. Records from the period show he was an exceptional shot long before the war began. He was not a large man, barely over 160 centimeters tall, but what he lacked in size, he compensated for with steadiness, calm hands, controlled breathing, the ability to wait. Finland itself was young and uneasy. It had declared independence from the collapsing Russian Empire in 1917, and in the years that followed, it endured its own brutal civil war. Though the country stabilized, its eastern border remained a source of tension. To the east lay the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, a superpower in the making. To Moscow, the proximity of the Finnish border to Leningrad was a strategic vulnerability. To Finland, sovereignty was non-negotiable. Throughout 1938 and 1939, diplomatic pressure mounted. The Soviets demanded territorial concessions, arguing they needed buffer zones for security. Finland hesitated, negotiated, stalled. Conceding land felt like surrendering independence piece by piece. Failed talks. On November 30th, 1939, without a formal declaration of war, Soviet forces crossed the border. Bombs fell on Finnish cities. Columns of Red Army troops pushed into the forests and across frozen terrain. The conflict would become known as the Winter War. For Finland, it was a fight for survival. The Soviet Union expected a quick victory. On paper, the imbalance was staggering. The Red Army deployed hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of tanks, and overwhelming artillery. Finland's army was small, under-equipped, and desperately short on heavy weapons. Many soldiers wore mismatched uniforms. Some lacked proper winter gear. What they had in abundance, however, was familiarity with the terrain and a culture shaped by it. When the invasion began, Häyhä was 34 years old. He was called up like countless other reservists. There was no dramatic transformation, no cinematic moment of destiny. One week he was tending to farm work. The next he was issued a rifle and sent to the front. He was assigned to a unit in the Kola sector, a heavily forested region that would become one of the most fiercely contested fronts of the war. The phrase Kola kestää, meaning Kola holds, would later symbolize Finnish resistance, but in those early days, nothing was certain. The temperatures plummeted to -30, even -40 degrees Celsius. Weapons froze, oil thickened, exposed skin could suffer frostbite in minutes. The winter itself became a weapon. Snow muffled footsteps, but amplified gunshots. The forests provided cover, yet they also concealed movement from all sides. The Finns, dressed in white camouflage smocks, blended into the landscape. Soviet troops, often advancing in larger formations, were more visible against the snow. The environment favored those who knew how to move silently, how to read the land, how to endure long hours without motion. Häyhä carried a standard-issue Mosin Nagant rifle, the Finnish M2830 variant. Notably, he chose to use iron sights rather than a telescopic scope. Later accounts suggest several practical reasons. A scope could fog in extreme cold, reflect light and reveal position, or require a higher shooting posture that exposed more of the sniper's head. Iron sights allowed him to keep a lower profile, pressing himself deep into the snow. He prepared his firing positions carefully. He packed snow in front of the rifle muzzle so that the blast would not kick up loose powder and betray him. He sometimes placed snow in his mouth to reduce the visible vapor of his breath. These details are not myth. They are consistent with the techniques described by those who fought in those conditions. Survival depended on minimizing every possible trace. In December 1939, as Soviet offensives intensified, Häyhä began his work as a sniper. There was no announcement, no fanfare, just a man in white lying motionless for hours in sub-zero cold, waiting for a target to pause for a fraction too long. The distances were often 100 to 400 meters, close enough for iron sights, far enough to remain unseen. At first, he was one among many marksmen scattered across the Finnish lines, but patterns began to emerge. Soviet patrols in certain sectors took disproportionate losses. Officers were targeted. Machine gun crews were picked off. The forest seemed alive with invisible threats. Rumors spread among Soviet soldiers of a phantom in white. The official Finnish records would later credit Häyhä with 542 confirmed kills by sniper rifle during the Winter War, yet those numbers remain the highest recorded for any sniper in a single conflict. Yet in the opening weeks, there was no legend, just cold, exhaustion, and a farmer applying the skills he had learned since boyhood. What makes the story so unsettling is its simplicity. There was no advanced technology, no elaborate training program designed to create a super soldier. The foundations were laid in frozen fields and silent forests long before the first shot of the Winter War was fired. Patience learned from hunting, endurance forged by farm labor, familiarity with snow and silence that outsiders underestimated. As 1939 turned into 1940, the snow deepened and the war grew harsher. Soviet commanders poured more men and firepower into the Finnish front. Artillery thundered across the tree line. Entire sections of forest were shredded by shells in attempts to eliminate hidden shooters. But the white landscape swallowed men whole, and somewhere within it, a small, steady figure remained almost impossible to detect. In the vast machinery of war between nations, it is easy to focus on divisions, tanks, and maps covered in arrows. Yet in the forests of Karelia, the conflict narrowed to something intimate and chilling. One man, one rifle, one breath held in the cold air. The invasion that was meant to crush a small nation in weeks instead met resistance shaped by terrain, culture, and individuals who understood both better than any invading force. And among them was a quiet farmer who would soon earn a name whispered in fear across the front lines, a name that had not yet become legend, but was already being written into the frozen silence of the Finnish winter. By the time December settled fully over the forests of eastern Finland, the war had already defied expectations. The Red Army had crossed the border in overwhelming numbers, confident that the campaign would be swift. Instead, its columns stalled in deep snow and dense woodland. Roads became narrow corridors of vulnerability. Engines froze, supply lines stretched thin, and in the white silence of Karelia, an invisible threat began to take shape. Simo Häyhä was now fully embedded with his unit along the Karelia front. The conditions were almost beyond imagination. Temperatures frequently dropped below -30 degrees Celsius, sometimes nearing -40. Metal burned the skin at a touch. Rifles had to be handled with care. Too much oil and the mechanism would seize. Too little and it would grind itself to failure.
Every movement had to be deliberate, every breath controlled. The snow was both ally and enemy. It concealed positions, but it also recorded mistakes. A careless footprint, a disturbed patch of powder, a glint of light, any of these could mean death. Finnish soldiers adapted quickly. They wore white camouflage suits over their uniforms, blending into the landscape so completely that at a distance they dissolved into the terrain. Soviet troops, often advancing in darker coats or in tight formations along roads, stood out against the endless white. Häyhä refined his methods with quiet precision. He selected positions before dawn and could remain motionless for hours. He packed snow in front of his rifle muzzle to prevent the blast from spraying powder into the air. He compacted the snow beneath his body to create a stable firing platform. In some accounts, fellow soldiers described how he would place snow in his mouth to reduce the vapor cloud of his breath in the frigid air. Nothing was left to chance. He used a Finnish M/28-30 rifle, a variant of the Mosin Nagant. Notably, he chose iron sights over a telescopic scope. In extreme cold, scopes could fog or freeze. They could also reflect light, betraying the shooter's position. Iron sights allowed him to keep his head lower, presenting less of a silhouette above the snow. It was a practical decision, rooted in experience, not bravado. The results were immediate and unsettling for the opposing forces. Soviet patrols moving through wooded sectors near Kola began to suffer sudden losses. Officers fell mid-command. Machine gunners collapsed beside their weapons. Sometimes there was no audible shot to identify a direction, only the abrupt impact and confusion that followed. In temperatures that already strained morale, uncertainty spread quickly. The Soviets had expected conventional resistance, defensive lines, artillery duels, visible troop movements. Instead, they encountered small Finnish units using guerrilla-style tactics, cutting off columns in what became known as motti operations, isolating segments of larger forces and destroying them piece by piece. Snipers played a critical role in this strategy, disrupting leadership and sowing fear. Among them, Häyhä's consistency set him apart. Confirmed kills were recorded by Finnish officers with witnesses, following strict procedures. By late December, his tally was climbing rapidly. What made his performance extraordinary was not only the number, but the time frame. Within weeks, he had accounted for dozens of enemy soldiers, then hundreds. The pace was relentless. Soviet troops began referring to an unseen Finnish sniper operating in white camouflage. The nickname White Death emerged from their ranks. It was not a title crafted by Finnish propaganda at first. It was born from the anxiety of soldiers who felt hunted in terrain they did not understand. The name spread because it captured something real, the sense that death could arrive from the snow itself. Yet, Häyhä was not operating in isolation from the broader struggle. The Battle of Kola was one of the fiercest engagements of the Winter War. Soviet forces launched repeated assaults, supported by artillery barrages designed to pulverize defensive positions. Entire sections of forest were blasted into splintered ruin. Trees shattered and fell, creating chaotic fields of debris. The ground shook under sustained shelling. Despite this, Finnish lines held. Kola kestää, Kola holds, became both a statement and a defiance. Soldiers endured frostbite, exhaustion, and constant threat. Food was basic and often cold. Sleep came in fragments. The psychological strain was immense. In that environment, maintaining focus as a sniper required more than marksmanship. It demanded emotional control. Häyhä's demeanor was described by comrades as quiet and composed. He did not boast. He did not seek attention. After engagements, he returned to his unit as if finishing routine work. His effectiveness lay not in dramatic gestures, but in repetition, position, weight, observe, fire, relocate. The landscape itself shaped the engagement distances. In forested terrain, visibility was often limited. Many of his shots were taken under 400 meters, sometimes much closer. This was not the mythic image of a sniper firing from extreme range across open plains. It was intimate, tense, and immediate. At those distances, skill with iron sights required exceptional familiarity with one's weapon and an instinct for trajectory in frigid air. By January 1940, reports of a highly effective Finnish sniper in the Kola sector had filtered upward through Soviet command channels. Counter-sniper teams were deployed. Artillery was directed toward suspected firing areas. The intention was clear: eliminate the threat. But locating a single man in white, lying motionless in endless snow, proved nearly impossible. Soviet snipers scanning the tree lines searched for the smallest irregularities. Meanwhile, Häyhä adjusted constantly, rarely using the same position twice in predictable patterns. His survival depended on anticipation, assuming that if he could see the enemy, they might eventually see him. As the weeks passed, his confirmed kill count continued to rise. By some Finnish records compiled after the war, he achieved over 500 confirmed sniper kills between December 1939 and early March 1940. These figures, documented by Finnish military authorities, remain the highest recorded for a sniper in a single conflict. While historians debate the exact totals in some cases, there is broad agreement that his impact was extraordinary. For Soviet soldiers on the ground, the numbers mattered less than the experience. Patrols moved more cautiously, heads stayed lower, trust in visible safety eroded. In extreme cold, fear carries differently. It lingers longer when the environment already feels hostile. The forest was no longer just terrain, it was a potential hiding place for an unseen rifleman. And still, beyond the growing legend, Häyhä remained what he had always been, a disciplined marksman shaped by rural life. The same patience required to wait hours for game in a Finnish forest now translated to a battlefield. The same tolerance for cold that farm work demanded allowed him to endure conditions that broke others. By midwinter, the war had transformed from an anticipated quick conquest into a grinding conflict that embarrassed the much larger Soviet Union on the world stage. International observers began to take note of Finland's resistance. Newspapers reported improbable stories of small units holding off massive assaults. Among these accounts, whispers of a sniper called the White Death circulated, adding a human focal point to the broader narrative. Yet in the snow outside of Kola, there were no headlines, only the steady rhythm of a rifle bolt sliding back and forth, the faint crack of a shot swallowed by trees, and the continued defense of a narrow stretch of frozen land. The legend was growing. The man remained almost invisible.
By January 1940, the war in eastern Finland had become something far more dangerous than anyone in Moscow had anticipated. What was meant to be a rapid campaign had stalled in forests and frozen swamps. Entire Soviet divisions were being cut apart in isolated pockets. Morale suffered under relentless cold. And in the Kola sector, one particular problem refused to disappear. Simo Häyhä had already built a reputation among his fellow soldiers, but now the reaction on the other side of the lines was becoming organized. Soviet commanders understood that sniper activity was not random harassment. Officers were being targeted. Machine gun crews were being neutralized. Patrols were breaking formation under sudden, precise fire. This was systematic. The Red Army responded the only way it knew how, with escalation. Counter-sniper teams were deployed into the forests around Kola. These were trained marksmen tasked specifically with hunting Finnish snipers. They moved cautiously, scanning tree lines, watching for unnatural shapes in the snow, waiting for the faintest flicker of movement.
At the same time, artillery units were ordered to bombard suspected sniper positions. If a shot was reported from a particular area, shells followed. The forest began to change. Trees shattered under high explosive fire. Snow erupted into blackened craters. Entire sections of woodland were flattened in attempts to eliminate a single concealed rifleman. But artillery is an imprecise solution to a precise problem. By the time shells landed, the shooter was often gone. Häyhä understood something fundamental about survival in that environment. Predictability was fatal. He rarely fired repeatedly from the exact same location. After a confirmed shot, he shifted, sometimes only meters, sometimes much farther. He used natural depressions, fallen trees, slight rises in terrain. The Finnish landscape offered endless variations to someone who knew how to read it. The temperatures remained brutally low. Prolonged exposure meant constant risk of frostbite. Fingers stiffened, eyelashes froze together. Yet witnesses later recalled that Häyhä seemed almost immune to complaint. He dressed efficiently, layered carefully, and conserved movement. Stillness was his shield. Motion drew attention. By now, his confirmed kill count had passed 300, then 400. The tally was recorded by Finnish officers following established procedures, requiring verification. The numbers were not self-reported legend, they were documented during an ongoing defensive campaign. In just weeks, the scale of his impact became undeniable. Among Soviet troops, the nickname White Death circulated more widely. It reflected not only fear, but frustration. Soldiers described shots that came without warning, from distances that felt impossibly concealed. Some believed there were multiple snipers operating in perfect coordination. Others imagined elaborate camouflage devices or hidden towers. The reality was simpler and more unsettling. A single man, exceptionally disciplined, exploiting terrain and patience. The psychological effect of a sniper cannot be measured only in casualties. It alters behavior, it slows movement, it forces hesitation. In winter conditions, hesitation can be lethal. Soviet units already struggling with frostbite and supply shortages now had to factor in the possibility that any exposed moment, a lit cigarette, a shouted order, a glance above cover, might be their last. Commanders increased efforts to silence the threat. More counter-snipers, more reconnaissance, more artillery saturation. Yet the forests of Kola did not yield easily. Visibility was limited. Sound distorted by cold air made locating the origin of shots difficult. Snow absorbed and redirected noise in unpredictable ways. At the same time, the broader Battle of Kola intensified. Waves of Soviet assaults struck Finnish defensive lines. Infantry advanced through waist-deep snow. Tanks attempted to push along narrow forest roads, vulnerable to ambush. The Finns, heavily outnumbered, relied on mobility and intimate knowledge of the land. Small units moved on skis, striking quickly before disappearing. In this chaos, Häyhä continued his work with mechanical consistency. He was not operating independently of his unit. He was part of a coordinated defense. His role was to disrupt leadership, reduce enemy firepower, and create openings for Finnish infantry. Each shot was calculated within that larger strategy. Reports suggest that Soviet forces even attempted to target him directly once his presence was suspected in a specific sector. Snipers were assigned to watch likely Finnish positions. Artillery observers scanned for muzzle flashes. Entire stretches of forest were shelled repeatedly in hopes of eliminating the so-called White Death. But a sniper who understands that he is being hunted becomes even more cautious. Simo minimized exposure time. He selected positions with multiple escape routes. He avoided silhouetting himself against open snow. He controlled his breathing to the point where he could remain nearly motionless for extended periods. In extreme cold, the discipline to lie still while muscles scream for warmth is as important as aim. By February 1940, the war entered a critical phase. the Soviet Union began committing even greater resources to break Finnish resistance, particularly on the Karelian isthmus. Though Kola was not the primary axis of the final breakthrough, it remained fiercely contested. Casualties mounted on both sides. By this stage, Häyhä's confirmed sniper kills were nearing their eventual total. According to Finnish military records compiled after the war, he would finish the Winter War with 542 confirmed kills by sniper rifle, in addition to further casualties attributed to his use of a submachine gun. Most of these occurred within a period of just over 100 days. Yet for all the numbers, the daily reality remained starkly physical. Hunger, fatigue, the constant concussion of artillery, the knowledge that at any moment a Soviet counter-sniper might already have him in sight. The hunter was also prey. There's a paradox in sniper warfare. The more successful the sniper becomes, the greater the effort to eliminate him. Success attracts attention. Attention attracts danger. By February, Soviet determination to neutralize high-impact Finnish shooters had intensified. The forests were no longer simply battlegrounds, they were search grids. And still, day after day, shots continued to find their mark. For Soviet soldiers, the sense of being observed never fully disappeared. For Finnish defenders, the presence of a marksman capable of such consistency became a quiet source of confidence. In a war defined by imbalance, small nation versus superpower, the idea that one individual could exert disproportionate influence carried symbolic weight. But symbols do not stop bullets. The longer the war dragged on, the greater the risk that even the most careful sniper would make a single fatal mistake or simply encounter a moment of bad fortune. By early March 1940, after months of relentless cold and combat, the forests of Kola were scarred and shattered. Soviet forces continued pressing hard across multiple fronts. The White Death had survived artillery barrages, counter-snipers, and the worst winter in decades. What no one on either side could know was that within days, a single shot would change everything. Not fired by him, but aimed directly at his face.
By early March 1940, the war had reached a breaking point. The forests of eastern Finland were shattered by months of artillery fire, and Soviet forces were intensifying their final offensives across multiple fronts. Along the Karelia line, where resistance had become legendary, the pressure never stopped. Shells fell daily, infantry probes tested weak points, the air itself seemed permanently charged with tension. Simo Häyhä had survived more than 3 months of near constant exposure to danger. He had endured extreme cold, counter-sniper hunts, and artillery strikes aimed specifically at silencing him. By Finnish military records, his confirmed sniper kills were approaching what would later be finalized at 542. It was an unprecedented figure, accumulated in roughly 100 days of combat. But survival in war is never guaranteed by skill alone. On March 6, 1940, during combat operations near Kola, Häyhä was struck by a bullet fired by a Soviet soldier. Accounts indicate it was an explosive round, designed to inflict maximum damage. The bullet hit him in the lower left jaw. The impact was catastrophic. Much of his jaw and cheek were shattered. He collapsed into the snow, gravely wounded. For a man who had built his effectiveness on invisibility and control, this was a sudden and brutal reversal. The hunter had been found. Fellow Finnish soldiers later recounted that when they reached him, he was barely recognizable due to the severity of the wound. He was still alive but unconscious. Blood stained the snow around him. Evacuating casualties under those conditions was dangerous and logistically difficult. Yet he was pulled from the battlefield and transported through a chain of field medical stations toward more advanced care. He slipped into a coma. For days he remained unconscious as the war around him continued to rage.
Soviet forces were pushing hard across the Karelian Isthmus, achieving breakthroughs that Finland struggled to contain. Ammunition stocks were dwindling, casualties were mounting. The small nation that had stunned the world with its resistance was nearing exhaustion. On that same day, according to several accounts, Simo Häyhä regained consciousness. The timing feels almost symbolic. As the war ended, the man who had become one of its most lethal defenders opened his eyes to a different battle, one for survival and recovery. The injury to his face required multiple surgeries. Reconstruction would take years. Photographs from the period after his wounding show the extent of the damage. The left side of his face was permanently altered. He would never return to combat in the same way. The war had ended before he could have done so anyway, but his service had already left its mark. Official Finnish records credited him with 542 confirmed sniper kills, the highest number recorded for any sniper in a single conflict. In addition, some accounts attribute over 200 additional enemy casualties to his use of a submachine gun, though sniper kills remain the most firmly documented figure. The confirmation process during the war required witnesses and reporting through command structures, giving historians a basis for evaluating the totals. Yet numbers alone do not capture the cost. The physical consequences of his wound were lifelong. Eating and speaking required adaptation. Reconstructive surgeries addressed functionality as much as appearance. In an era before modern maxillofacial techniques, recovery was slow and painful. The same resilience that had allowed him to lie motionless in sub-zero temperatures was now tested in hospital rooms and rehabilitation. While he healed, the global perception of the Winter War solidified. International observers had watched as a small Nordic country resisted one of the world's largest military powers for over 3 months. Though ultimately forced into concessions, Finland's defense had exposed weaknesses within the Red Army and reshaped strategic calculations in Europe. Within that larger narrative, Simo Häyhä's story became emblematic of asymmetric resistance, how individual skill, terrain familiarity, and discipline could counter overwhelming numbers. But unlike the mythic figure that newspapers sometimes portrayed, he was now a wounded veteran facing an uncertain future. He had come within a single bullet of death. Had the angle been slightly different, had evacuation been delayed, his story would have ended in that snow on March 6th. Instead, he survived the most devastating shot of his life. There is a stark irony in the trajectory of his wartime experience. For over 3 months, he operated with extraordinary precision, avoiding exposure, minimizing risk, outmaneuvering efforts to eliminate him. In the end, it took only one moment, one enemy rifleman, one fraction of a second to bring him down. The Winter War itself demonstrated a similar lesson. No amount of tactical brilliance could entirely offset material imbalance forever. Finland had held longer than expected. It had inflicted disproportionate losses, but attrition, resources, and sheer scale eventually forced compromise. As peace settled uneasily over the ceded territories, the forests of Kola grew quiet. Snow covered the scars of shell craters and trenches. The echoes of artillery faded. The White Death, whose presence had once haunted advancing troops, now lay recovering, his war abruptly concluded, not by strategy, but by survival. He would carry the wound for the rest of his life, a visible reminder of how close he came to becoming just another name among the fallen. Instead, he endured, crossing from legend in the making into living testimony of one of the most extraordinary chapters in modern military history.
When the guns fell silent in March 1940 and the Winter War came to an end, Finland was scarred but unbroken. Territory had been lost to the Soviet Union, entire communities were displaced, and thousands of soldiers would never return home. Among the survivors was a man whose name had already begun to circulate far beyond the forests of Kola, Simo Häyhä. He did not awaken to parades or speeches. He awoke to pain, to hospital walls, and to the long process of rebuilding a face shattered by an explosive bullet. Surgeons worked to reconstruct his jaw and cheek. Recovery was slow and grueling. Eating, speaking, even resting carried discomfort. In an era before modern reconstructive techniques, such injuries often meant permanent disability. Yet he endured, just as he had endured the cold. During the war, he had been promoted from corporal to second lieutenant, an unusually large jump in rank, reflecting recognition of his effectiveness. Official Finnish military records credited him with 542 confirmed sniper kills, the highest documented total for any sniper in a single war. The figure was compiled through battlefield reporting procedures that required verification. While historians debate the exact margins, there is broad agreement that his impact was extraordinary. But if the world expected a triumphant warrior eager to retell his story, it found the opposite. After his recovery, Häyhä returned to rural life in Finland. He resumed farming. He bred dogs. He hunted moose. The rhythms of the countryside reclaimed him. He rarely sought public attention and gave few interviews. When asked years later how he had achieved such results as a sniper, his answer was famously simple: practice. There was no grand philosophy, no dramatic self-mythologizing. He attributed his effectiveness to training, discipline, and familiarity with his rifle. The same traits that had defined him before the war remained intact afterward: quiet competence, restraint, and a preference for solitude. Yet outside his own modest life, his reputation continued to grow. Military historians and sniper instructors studied his methods. His decision to use iron sights instead of a telescopic scope became a point of analysis. In extreme cold, optics could fog or reflect light. Iron sights allowed a lower profile and reduced risk of detection. His fieldcraft, packing snow to stabilize his rifle, minimizing breath vapor, maintaining absolute stillness, became examples in discussions of camouflage and environmental adaptation. Modern sniper doctrine, shaped through later conflicts across the 20th century, emphasizes many of the same fundamentals: concealment, patience, psychological resilience, and intimate knowledge of terrain. While technology evolved, advanced optics, rangefinders, ballistic computers, the core principles remained strikingly similar to those practiced in the forests of Kola. The myth, however, often threatened to overtake the man. Stories circulated that exaggerated distances, embellished duels, or portrayed him as superhuman. In reality, most of his confirmed shots were taken at relatively moderate ranges, often under 400 meters. His effectiveness came not from impossible marksmanship, but from consistency under brutal conditions. He was not invisible. He was disciplined. He was not supernatural. He was prepared. As decades passed, the Winter War itself took on symbolic weight. It became a case study in asymmetric resistance, a small nation leveraging terrain, morale, and tactical innovation against overwhelming numbers. Häyhä's story fit naturally into that narrative. One individual, operating within a broader defensive effort, had demonstrated how skill could multiply impact. He lived a long life, far longer than many who fought in those forests. He witnessed Finland navigate the delicate balance of post-war geopolitics, maintaining independence while coexisting beside a powerful neighbor. Through it all, he remained largely private. In interviews late in life, he did not dwell on hatred or glory. He spoke matter-of-factly about doing his duty. When asked if he felt remorse, he framed his actions within the context of defending his country during invasion. The war, in his view, had not been a quest for personal achievement, it had been survival. He died in 2002 at the age of 96. By then, his place in military history was firmly established.
The record of 542 confirmed sniper kills during the Winter War remained unmatched in a single conflict. His nickname, the White Death, endured in books, documentaries, and discussions among soldiers and historians alike. Yet perhaps the most compelling part of his legacy is not the number, but the contrast. A quiet farmer from rural Finland became for a brief and violent winter one of the most lethal marksmen in recorded warfare. He faced an army measured in hundreds of thousands and left an imprint disproportionate to his rank, size, or background. Then he returned to obscurity by choice, preferring forests and fields over fame. In the end, his story is not simply about a sniper. It is about environment shaping ability, about preparation meeting crisis, about how in the vast machinery of war, individuals still matter. The snow of Kola long ago melted and fell again in endless cycles. Forests regrew over shattered ground, borders shifted on maps, but the image remains, a solitary figure in white, motionless against the winter landscape, embodying both the fragility and the resilience of a nation fighting to endure.